waffle time. So what I want to get into this week is the Super Nintendo, or the SNES, however you call it. And this is a console that I've not had in my collection until recently. I originally, as I've said a few times before, I had one in the early 90s, but I only had it for about 6 months. I originally had a Megadrive and a Mega CD, and at that point I was feeling it was getting a bit long in the tooth. Idiot, I know. But I wanted to buy 3DO. I saw one at it was some kind of fair, and I thought, yeah, this is really good. And I saw Road Rash and Need for Speed, and I thought, this is the future. And I decided to sell the Mega Drive and Mega CD to a kid at school, and I got some money for it. And I thought, I'll buy a 3DO, but I hadn't checked how much they actually cost. And then when I saw how much the 3DO cost, I thought, there's no way I can afford that. So I decided to buy a SNES. And I think this is really where, I suppose, the point of this comes from. Back in the day, as a Mega Drive owner, you'd see screenshots of a SNES game, or many SNES games, and Street Fighter 2 being the good example, and it always looked like the better console. And I'm sure there's a degree of, you know, the other man's grass is always greener, but I think at least from the magazines, SNES games always looked better. And there were a whole bunch of games that I wanted to play, like the Mario games and the Donkey Kong games and the SuperFX games, and Street Fighter 2, although that did come out on the Mega Drive a little bit later. And I remember picking the machine up, and one of the first games that I played on it was Super Return of the Jedi. And I remember my dad saying to me, he knew how much I'd paid for the console, and it was probably about 100 quid at the time, with Mario and Mario All-Stars and Mario Kart. It was the Mario theme pack. And he said to me, he says, this little console looks better than the Mega CD did. And I thought about it, I thought, well, actually maybe it is, that you've got this little machine and you don't need the expensive add-ons, and you get the, I'll come on to this later, you get the little add-ons like the SuperFX chips, but it's all in one console. And I thought this was a really good machine. But I sold it. I only had it for about 6 months, and or maybe longer, maybe a year. And I traded everything in for the Saturn. I think as a collector now, it's easier to pick these machines up and build up a library. But as a kid, you didn't have a lot of money. If a new machine came out, you sold your old catalogue and all your games for a new machine with 1 or 2 games. And oh, the regrets on that. Some of the games I got rid of, I'm thinking it would have been better just to stick with that machine. But I think my first experience of the SNES, I remember when I first heard about it, and this would have been probably when I just got the Mega Drive. And a friend of mine got one at school, and he said, it's like an Amiga in a console. And I thought, that's not right. The Amiga is expensive, and it's this nice piece of kit with all this custom hardware. How can they put it in a console? And I saw it, and it looked a bit like an Amiga. The sound was more or less the same. I know it's a different sound chip, but it sounded a lot more like the Amiga than the Mega Drive did. And with all the Mode 7. And for years I always thought of the Amiga as being a console other way around, the SNES as being a console version of the Amiga. But looking back now, I don't think that's true. It's almost like the Mega Drive and the SNES copied, well, they took different bits of the Amiga. So the SNES has got the graphics chips and it's got the sound chips, but the CPU is slow. It's a 16-bit version of the 6502, which is what powered the Commodore 64 and the VIC-20 and some of the early Atari machines. And it only runs at 3.5 megahertz, which is slow even by early 90s standards, whereas the Mega Drive has a 7.5 megahertz 68000, which is the CPU that was in the Atari ST and the Amiga. So in a way, when I look back now, and certainly look back at the library of games, the Mega Drive got more Amiga conversions than the SNES did. And I never really thought about that at the time, and perhaps the Megadrive is more like a console version of the Amiga with the games. It just doesn't have the colour depth and doesn't have the sound chip, but it has the fast CPU. And I suppose from a collecting perspective, my story with getting into retro collecting was quite early. It was probably about 1999, and I think you reach a point where you buy new machines and something makes you look back. And for me, it was at school in the sixth form. One guy there brought in a Megadrive. It was an old Megadrive that he just had in his attic and not used. I think he had a PlayStation or an N64, so he just brought it in and he almost donated it. And we used to play it at lunchtime. And I remember playing Lemmings and Super Bomberman, or Mega Bomberman rather, and thinking, actually these games are a lot more fun than the modern games. So this would have been the PlayStation and the Saturn. And I don't want that to be a sweeping statement, but there was a certain quality that I thought was missing, and I actually thought, I really miss my Mega Drive. I want to get another one. So I bought one second hand with a Mega CD, and it was dirt cheap at the time because no one was really collecting them. And over the years I've bought, you know, different consoles, but never a SNES. And I've thought about it again and again and again, and I've looked on eBay, and they've been quite expensive, but I saw one going for quite a cheap price and not many people were bidding on it, and I thought, I'll try it, and I got it for a reasonable price, so I was quite happy with that. And I was starting to think about the games for the SNES, and I think in the early 90s, if you looked at games that came out on both machines, at least from magazines, you'd see the screenshots and think the Mega Drive version is the inferior one. But I don't think it was. I think there were a lot of games that, on the SNES, again going back to the CPU thing, they've got these big, nice looking, you know, high coloured sprites, but the games often move quite slow. And I think some of the ports between the Mega Drive and the SNES version doesn't play quite as well, and I think perhaps Earthworm Jim is one of the most famous examples that it has a much better colour depth and better sound, but the gameplay isn't quite as good as the Mega Drive version. And you might even say that for Street Fighter 2. The games are slightly different, and some people prefer the Mega Drive, some people prefer the SNES version. But you can see how each console has its own strengths, and I think the first party titles are the ones that make it interesting. And I've looked at the games and I'm thinking, the Mega Drive, there must be 50, 100 good first party titles, or, you know, console exclusive titles, but the SNES, I thought there were the same amount, and there aren't. There are a lot of good first party Nintendo games like Mario and Donkey Kong and Nola's, like ActRaiser. Was that a first party one? Anyway, you know what I mean, these well known titles. And I've looked back at it and I actually thought, what was so appealing about the SNES? And I think, looking back now, there were some really interesting games that were not... They were not typical games that were better on the SNES, but it was where the SNES was trying to do something different. And Mode 7 was a good example. But the other one, and this is the one I've showed the other day, which is Stunt Race FX, it has the SuperFX chip in it. And I think they did a really good thing there by having a console that you could upgrade in the cartridges. And I think this is where Sega got it wrong, because you've got you're probably aware of this, you've got the big debate about which is more powerful. You've got the SuperFX and you've got Virtual Racing with Sega's SVP. And I think Sega really dropped the ball there. They did something which should have been a good business decision. By the problem with the SNES games, with the SuperFX ones, is that you had to buy effectively the SuperFX chip with every cartridge, which put the price up. So Sega released the SVP, and it was 70 quid, and there was no way you were going to buy that game unless you were incredibly rich or rented it. And what they thought about doing was, why don't we make something that you can just plug into your console once, and then buy games for it. And that should have been a good idea. You end up with a 32X, but it ends up being an add-on. And it means that you're looking around in the shop, you see these games, oh, you've got to buy the add-on. And if it had been I mean, how much would the SVP cost to manufacture? 20 quid, something like that? If they'd have just put an SVP in a cartridge, sold it for 10, 20 quid, that would have been a really good thing to have, but they didn't. They sold it at 150 and effectively made a new console. They made another Mega CD. And I think that was a real shame. We could have had some really nice games, but going back to the SNES, this capability that it had really made for some interesting games, and these aren't your typical 16-bit games. This is almost the SNES reaching into the next generation, and it's probably hard to quantify, but there was a generation between the 16-bit and the 32-bit consoles. So you had the Jaguar and the 3DO, and those consoles were trying to break new ground, but they didn't really have the horsepower to do arcade quality 3D. And I think the SNES had a fairly good crack at that with the SuperFX, and even the SuperFX 2, there was a really good version of Doom on the SNES. And yeah, it's cut down, it's perhaps the most inferior of all the versions, but it plays really smooth, and it plays well. And you think, you know, this is a console from 1991 that was designed to play Super Mario, and it's being extended to play Doom, and who would have thought that? And even Yoshi's Island, or Mario World 2, whatever you want to call it, it was a game that used the SuperFX chip, but did it in such a subtle way, and it tried to provide a more traditional gaming experience, but souped up as far as it'd go. And I think for 2D, even now, Yoshi's Island looks really good, and we've had nearly 20 years worth of games, well, almost 20 years worth of platform or 2D games on top of that. And yeah, they look better now, but not that much. That game really does stand up well now. And it's interesting, almost going back to my father's comment about the SNES, in his eyes, looked better than the Mega CD, and I'm thinking, that's a really interesting thing to compare, because it was certainly graphically better than the Mega Drive, but do we compare the SNES against the Mega Drive and the CD? Particularly if we're comparing the SuperFX, then do we have to bring everything in? Do we say the SNES with a SuperFX versus a Mega Drive with a Mega CD and a 32X? And it's a really interesting question, and I suppose that maybe one way of putting it is, for the cost of just buying a SNES and Doom, you get something which is graphically way better than anything that the Mega CD could produce. I would say that's a fair comparison. I can't see the Mega CD being capable of Doom. But the 32X version of Doom was a little bit better than the SNES one, but it wasn't that much better. And it seems having something which is in a cartridge like that attached to a 1991 console is really impressive. And I suppose what I'll come on to is, with it being Christmas, a Christmas story with the SNES, so I'll finish it with this. When I was at primary school, so this was the first time I ever actually saw a SNES physically, Santa comes to your school. So this would have been 1991, so I would have been probably about 10 or 11 at the time. And when he came, if you've not already worked out, he's not really Santa. The real Santa's too busy, so he delegates it. And this Santa's really poor, so what poor parents have to do is they have to give Christmas presents to this not quite the real Santa. And what normally happens is it's a little thing, so it's some chocolates or a little toy or something like that, and it's nice for, you know, Santa comes to school and he brings his bag and he's dressed up and he goes and he sits at the front and he calls the kids' names out, and you get presents, and it's nice to see. But the important thing is not everyone comes from the same background, and not everyone can buy the kids the same thing for Christmas. So what they tend to do is, in at least when I was a kid at school, everyone got a little token thing. It was nothing particularly expensive. But there was one guy, and his parents were from Hong Kong, and I don't know if they really celebrated Christmas at that point. I know it's a big commercial thing now, but in the early 90s, I'm not sure if it had made its way over there to the degree that it has now. And they misjudged it, and I think they thought this was his Christmas present. So Santa comes in one year with this big sack, and they call these kids out, and you're getting some pens and blah blah blah, and calls this kid out, his name was Johnny, and called Johnny out, and out comes, so Santa pulls this great big Super Nintendo box out of his sack, and all the kids are just going, why hasn't Santa given me that? They all thought it was the real Santa. Well, some did. And I remember the kids afterwards being so upset, thinking, why has Santa given him a Super Nintendo and me a box of pens and things like that? And I'd worked out from quite an early age that Santa wasn't real, having found my Christmas presents in my parents' wardrobe. But a lot of kids at that age, 10 years old in the early 90s, a lot of kids believed in it. And I always remember that the first time I actually saw the SNES, and it was a big box version with Street Fighter 2, and that was something every kid wanted after reading Meme Machines and magazines like that, or CVG, and just to see this and just to see the other kids' faces. I just felt so bad. There was a kid who we used to share kind of cars, we did like a school run, and he really believed in Santa at that point, and he was so upset that Santa had given him this, I think his was the box of pens, it was some colouring felt tip pens, and given this other kid a Super Nintendo, and he was so upset by that, and that always stuck in my mind. And for me, the SNES was something that, even owning a Megadrive, I'd read about, but I was familiar with, and I actually thought, why haven't I picked this up in my collection? And I know that other than cost, and the fact that maybe looking back now, as to repeat myself, there perhaps aren't as many really good games as I tended to remember, but there are some good titles, and I can see why people, maybe less so in this country, it tends to be more the American guys that they have a real affection for the NES and the SNES. And I think this goes back to, I suppose it's the culture in the UK of growing up, certainly in my case, I grew up on machines like the Sinclair Spectrum and the BBC, and the NES and the Master System, you'd see them, but I wasn't really that impressed having seen the consoles. And I actually I bought a Master System with some Christmas money and birthday money, and I remember buying it and thinking, this is a rip-off, because I bought it and then saw the games and they were 30 quid, and I thought, this is really expensive. So I ended up buying the Megadrive with more expensive games, which seems weird, but for the quality of them it seemed better paying a few pound more, or 5 quid more, for a Megadrive game than 30 quid for a Master System game, which seems a bit odd, but there you go. And I think it's interesting that back then we had these camps. You'd have one machine or the other. I don't think I knew anyone who had both, and that people really have this affection. And I think it's easy to look at, being a Sega fan and looking at the Nintendo guys and thinking, I really don't see the appeal. But having played some of these SNES games, for this 6-month year period, I understand the affection people have. I don't think I quite have the attachment to the machine, but looking back at it, despite all the wars about which is more powerful, and as I said earlier, it's really hard to say. You've got the different CPU, you've got the colour depth, you've got the sound chip, and it just makes for really different games. Whereas now you've got the 360 and the PS3, and they're fairly clear cut. You know, oh, not clear cut. It's similar. There's not that much difference. But the Megadrive and the SNES architecturally were such different machines. You ended up with really a case where the first party titles or the exclusive ones really made the difference. And I think that's a really nice thing as a, I suppose, as a collector, that you're not really in a position to say, okay, if you've got both machines, which game do you buy on, you know, one or the other? It tends to be fairly clear cut. Whereas if you've got something which was, you know, an Amiga style game, or got lots of fast moving things, you go for the Mega Drive one, or the arcade style ones, you go for the Mega Drive. Whereas if you want your Nintendo style games or SuperFX, you go for your SNES. And I think that's a really good thing. And it's nice to see, I've seen quite a few videos recently from different people in the YouTube community starting to look back at the SNES games and really re-evaluate this. And even the video the other day by Steve Benway looking at the TurboGrafx and looking back at these consoles from the perspective of the quality of the games, not what's inside them, not what the chips or the CPUs are, but the actual quality of the games. And it's interesting just to see that each console really does have its own strength, and I think that's a really nice thing. So this has probably gone on for far too long, so if you've got any memories or comments or anything you want to discuss on this, then please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your feedback. So thanks for watching.